my creative friends. I'm Heather North from heatherscreativeblessings.com. Last week I made this card for the Stamp Nation Challenge, and I was asked how I made this one layer card. I'm going to change it up. It's not just going to be one layer, but this is basically what I did. For this card, I'm going to use a very vanilla card base. I'm going to use a black mat. It's 4 1/8 by 5 3/8, which is just 1/8 of an inch bigger than my newsprint paper. This paper comes from the Lost and Found, I think it's called Blush Stack from My Mind's Eye. There's lots of subtle prints. You could use any one of these. You just want something that won't compete with your stamping. So my designer series paper here is 4 by 5 1/4 inches, and to make my template I'm going to take a piece of Whisper White Stampin' Up! Cardstock, and I'm going to cut it to the same size as my background piece. So it's 4 by 5 1/4. If you were going to do a one layer card, you would do it 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. So this was a solid piece, obviously it's already been die cut, but I centered it in the top middle, and I put a heart framelit over it and ran it through my big shot. So what this does is by centering that framelit onto my template, I can have my heart end up exactly where I want it to be on the finished card. I now have both a positive and a negative heart I can use as a template. Ooh, don't use a pen. You use a mechanical pencil here for this next step. I'm just going to take a mechanical pencil and lightly trace the widest parts here and the top of my heart. You can trace the entire thing. I just kind of needed to know where that heart was so I could center my stamp. If you have a bigger stamp that's going to fill the entire framelit like I did on my first card, you might want to trace the entire thing. What I have here is a two-way glue pen. When you put it on, it's wet, and if you adhere it right to paper, paper to paper, it's going to have a permanent adhesion. But if you put it on and then set it aside to air dry, it will give you a temporary adhesive, more like a post-it note. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm also going to put it onto this little heart. I'm not using it on this card today, but I'm going to use it on a different project. So I also have that temporary glue, or I have the two-way glue on there, and I'm going to set both of these aside to dry. While that glue is drying, I'm going to do some stamping. I have here the Love Story stamp set from My Favorite Things. I just love it. It reminds me of my best friend's wedding because she used some of those quotes in her vows. Anyway, sorry, rabbit trail. I'm going to take one of the sentiments and I'm going to ink it up with this VersaFine black onyx ink. It's a great fine detail ink, but it takes a while to dry. So my solution is just to stamp my image and then pour some clear embossing powder over it, then heat set that embossing powder. What this does is it prevents it from smearing, gets it nice and dry. It also gives it a nice little bit of shine with it, just a little bit of raised texture. So the sentiment pops out even more. Plus, we need to emboss in order to emboss resist. If you didn't want to use black ink, you could just use VersaFine, or I'm sorry, you could use Versamark and a clear or white embossing powder, or really any color of your choice before doing this technique. If you use clear embossing powder, you're going to see what's beneath it. So you're going to see the ink or the paper or the pattern paper. If you used a colored embossing powder like black or green or pink, that's the color you're going to see. Since this paper is really thin, I heated up my heat tool before I put it to the paper, and I just tested it on my hand there. This will help prevent some of the warping. Before I move on to my next step, I want to make sure that I erase those pencil marks. So I just use that scrap paper to make sure that my eraser is clean, and then erase all the pencil marks. And then I'll take my template and just check to make sure that it's tacky, and it is, but not wet any longer. Then I'm going to line it up with my paper that I just stamped. And as you can see, I actually used my table to kind of tap it and make sure that it was straight all the way around. Now we get to do the emboss resist portion. I'm starting here with Blushing Bright ink from Stampin' Up. It's a very light pink, and I'm just going to do it in the center of my paper. So what I do is I get some ink on my sponge and then I rub off some of the excess on my grid mat. Now this ink pad needs to be re-inked, so it's not very juicy, and I was able to, after I laid down my first little bit of color, go back over it a couple of times without having to kind of rub off. But these darker colors I'm really going to need to be careful with. So the second color is Rose Red, and not only do I kind of rub off on my grid mat, I also start on the cardstock template and then rub it into the paper. I'm going to slow it down here in a second so you can really see what I'm doing. I rub into the paper and then I rub back out, in and out. And by doing this, I get a really crisp line around that heart because I really want that heart shape to stand out. If you want your color a little bit darker, you can do what I'm doing and just go in a couple more times. It seems kind of weird to rub off a bunch of ink and then go over it a few times, but this is the best way I've found to get a really smooth color. Now I'm moving to Real Red from Stampin' Up! And before I switched colors, I rubbed off as much of that Rose Red as I could. It doesn't really matter here, but if you were changing to extremely different colors, you'd want to do that. And now you can really start to see that heart take shape, and also kind of the glow that's left in the center. The last color I'm using is Raspberry Jam Shadowing from Hero Arts. It's a really deep pinky red, wine red maybe, and I'm just barely going over the edge, and it just adds a nice little depth. And mostly I was pulling that back towards the edge of my template. Now for the fun part, the big reveal. Just take off your paper, and because we let that 2-way glue dry, it just comes right off. Isn't that cool? So you could do this just as a one-layer card like I did before. What I did on the sample is I then put a mask on and took a different color and rubbed out from the inside of the heart to create a background. But because I used designer series paper this time, pattern paper, I don't need to do that. I'm just going to leave it really clean and simple. All that's left is assembling my card. So I'm just going to use some snail adhesive and layer my stamped and sponged piece onto that black cardstock and then adhere that to my card front. I'll finish this card off with a little baker's twine bow and some sequins from Pretty Pink Posh, and this card is ready to be mailed or given to my sweetheart. This card meets all of the Operation Right Home guidelines, so I might be sending it into OWH. Then again, I might give it to my husband. I'm not sure yet. If you like learning techniques like this, be sure and check the link down below. The new class just went live at Creativity Grows Here. It's called Technique Toolbox, Creative Uses for Dye Inks. I know it's a big mouthful, but there are just tons of ideas of different ways you can use dye inks to create cards. Thanks for joining me today. I hope that you find some time to get creative. Bye!